if we're in a situation where we're trying to get Putin to back off, to like come to the table, to stop doing what he's doing, it's not going to be because he's lost 820,000 soldiers, which is what the Ukrainians are estimating as of today. It'll be because he can't afford to anymore. And Putin has done a pretty good job up until now of pretending like the Russian economy is doing fine, but it's not. The Russian economy is suffering from really high inflation, very high interest rates. All the funding of the entire war is basically tapping out all major Russian corporations. 40% of the government budget is spent on the military, industrial complex to fight the war in Ukraine. This is not an economy that anyone could categorize as being good or robust, and so Trump is not wrong in that respect.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're delighted to be joined by one of our favourite guests here on Frontline, the financier and political activist Bill Browder. He's the founder and CEO of Hermitage Capital Management and was the largest foreign investor in Russia until 2005, when he was banned from the country for exposing corruption. He now campaigns to impose sanctions against corrupt people linked to the Putin regime and to free political activists who have been imprisoned by it. Bill, it's always a pleasure. Welcome back to Frontline.
Great to be here.
Let's begin with what we saw yesterday, Donald Trump returning to the White House for his second term as president. In his inaugural address, he didn't specifically talk about Russia and Ukraine, but in the Oval Office, when he was signing executive orders afterwards, he did make some comments that I thought were interesting. He said that Zelensky wants to make a deal. He said he didn't know if Putin does, but he should. And he also said that Putin is destroying Russia by not making a deal. What do you make of that?
Well, this is really a tea leaf reading exercise. It's nobody knows where Trump is on any of this stuff. There's a few things we do know. Well, we know that Trump historically has given Putin a pass on some of his nasty behavior, like murdering and so on. We know that Trump has said he thinks he'd like to get along with Putin, or he thinks he can get along with Putin. We've also heard people from his camp, from his proxies, being very sort of derogatory towards Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. We hear there's people from his camp that have been derogatory about U.S. military aid to Ukraine. That there's a common theme. His son has made all sorts of very unpleasant comments in that regard, and so that's what we have to work with. There's not much more, and so on one hand, of course, we would love for Trump to continue to be tough on Russia and to be supportive of Ukraine, and so everybody is sort of scratching their heads and trying to figure out every little thing that he says. What does that mean? Does that mean he's going to be better or worse? We also know that he said he promised he was going to solve the war in 24 hours, and they've now revised that promise to 100 days. So I think what we have going on right now is the reality is overtaking campaign promises. We don't really know whether Trump wants to be good on this issue as far as I'm concerned or not. We hope he is. And so he makes little comments like he did yesterday. And what does that tell us? It tells us that, yes, this is a complicated problem. Of course, it couldn't be solved in 24 hours. Nobody, if it could have been, then a lot of other people would have solved it. So now he's got a complicated problem. He doesn't know where Putin stands. He knows where Zelensky stands. And I guess we all have to just wait and see how he decides to play it.
I thought it was also really interesting that when he was making those comments while signing the executive orders in the Oval Office, he spoke specifically about the Russian economy. And he said, and I quote, "It's in big trouble," which it is in many respects. But the fact that he, who is a man who thinks in terms of economics, has seized on that, does that suggest almost that Trump has sensed that the soft underbelly maybe of Putin's war effort is the Russian economy?
Well, it's always been the Russian economy. So if we're in a situation where we're trying to get Putin to back off, to like come to the table, to stop doing what he's doing, it's not going to be because he's lost 820,000 soldiers, which is what the Ukrainians are estimating as of today. It'll be because he can't afford to anymore. And Putin has done a pretty good job up until now of pretending like the Russian economy is doing fine, but it's not. The Russian economy is suffering from really high inflation, very high interest rates. All the funding of the entire war is basically tapping out all major Russian corporations. 40% of the government budget is spent on the military, industrial complex to fight the war in Ukraine. This is not an economy that anyone could categorize as being good or robust, and so Trump is not wrong in that respect.
It's interesting also, Trump was talking in his inaugural address about, making more use of American oil and gas and drill, baby, drill. Could one of the byproducts of that be that if North America is producing more oil, the global oil price dips and that also impacts the Russian economy?
There's no question that if Trump follows through on his, making America a bigger oil exporter, that the oil price will go down. If supply goes up, then the price goes down, and if the price goes down, then who benefits? Well, Ukraine benefits, and Russia loses, and so that could be a very good thing. But I would caution anybody listening to this that this drill baby drill thing is a long-term strategy. This is not a overnight thing, and it's not going to happen tomorrow that all of a sudden the oil prices go down. This is industrial policy. Over time, people will be incentivized to invest in more oil exploration, and that should lead to more oil discovery, and that should lead to more oil exports. But this is the kind of stuff that takes a year or two or three. It doesn't happen overnight.
So if in the meantime you wanted to ramp up the economic pressure on Putin, what else should the US government and other Western allies of Ukraine be looking at? I mean, is it clamping down again on the shadow fleet? Is it sanctions again? What more would you like to see happen?
Well, the main place in which Russia continues to be able to fund their war is with their oil exports. And so it would seem logical that we should find every way of disrupting those oil exports so that Russia doesn't get the money that they're currently getting, because without that money, they couldn't fund this war. Now, of course, the counter argument to going after Russia's oil is that Russia produces 10% of the world's oil. And so if you were to fully embargo 10% of the world's oil, then the oil price would shoot up, perhaps dramatically. And we have many governments around the world that don't want oil prices high because we're fighting with inflation. And so that's not a very easy thing to do. But there are other measures in between total embargo and doing nothing, which could be done. And so, as you mentioned, there's this shadow fleet. And the shadow fleet has basically been a fleet of really old oil tankers that have been bought by Russia or as proxies. And the purpose of this shadow fleet is to basically avoid any type of oil price caps. There's currently an oil price cap in place that says Russia can't earn more than $60 a barrel. And so if the shadow fleet is eliminated or sanctioned or curtailed, then the amount of money that Russia gets from this oil sales goes down. I've been proposing a solution to various governments, which is to go after the Indian, Chinese, and Turkish oil refineries that are buying the Russian crude oil, and say, if you buy Russian crude oil and you refine it, we will sanction you and make it very painful for anyone to buy any refined product from you. And guess what will happen? They won't buy Russian crude oil. That oil will be floating around, and perhaps those who do buy it will be buying it at a 50% discount, which means that Russia makes less money. And so there's ways of dealing with this problem, which I think don't solve it entirely, but continue to put pressure on Putin, deprive him of some of the revenues he gets, which means it's just harder and harder for him to continue to fund the war.
Bill, from those conversations you've been having, what is the reluctance on the part of Western governments to take those measures?
I don't think there's any overall reluctance. I mean, up until now, up until yesterday, there was no reluctance other than the fact that to do these things, you need to do them on a multilateral basis. You can't just have the United States do it or the UK do it or whatever. Everybody needs to do it together. And governments move very slowly. They're very bureaucratic. Decisions don't get made in the same time frame that regular business decisions or personal decisions get made. And so that's been the problem. I stressed that this was the problem up until 2 days ago. Now we don't know. Will Trump impose any more sanctions? Will he lift sanctions? Anything could happen here. And until we kind of know the direction of travel, it's very hard to know what could happen. But if he were to lift sanctions, it would be catastrophic. It would basically ease the pressure on Russia so that they have more money to fight the war. And if they have more money to fight the war, more Ukrainians will be killed. And Ukraine will then require more money from whoever is continuing to fund them to fight back. So I think it's a huge unknown, and it's something that we're all just sitting here looking for any clue which way it's going to go.
We hope you're enjoying today's episode of Frontline. Don't forget, you can also now listen to Frontline in podcast form. Just search for The World in 10 from wherever you get your podcasts, where you can also hear daily analysis of the biggest stories relating to war and defence. And we'll put a link to The World in 10 in the description below. Bill, you're a man who understands how Vladimir Putin operates. How much of a handle does he have on the Russian economy on a day-to-day basis? According to reports, he relies quite a lot on the governor of the central bank in Russia, Elvira Nabiullina, who does a lot of the kind of day-to-day management. Does Putin fully appreciate the trouble his economy is in? Does he have much of a grasp on things day-to-day?
There's no question. I mean, Putin may be an evil man. He may be a psychopath or a sociopath, but he's not stupid, and particularly when it comes to money. He understands perfectly and exactly what's going on with his economy. But you should understand that this is just that he's a poker player, and when Russians play poker, all they do is raise and bluff, and so that's what he's doing here. No matter how bad his hand is, he's going to continue to put more money in the pot and to try to bluff us out. That's how he operates.
And how much concern is there within Russia and within some of those circles around the Kremlin about the rising cost of the war? I mean, you now have a situation where, and I appreciate what you said earlier, Bill, about the Russian casualty rate, tragic though it is for those who lose their lives on the front line. Of course, it doesn't really matter to Vladimir Putin. We know he's happy just feeding people into the meat grinder, and he can get more troops from North Korea or from other foreign sources, wherever. But of course, the cost of doing so, and the cost also of increasing the financial incentives for Russians to sign up to the armed forces, are going up. Is that a genuine cause for concern for those around Putin at the top levels of Russian society and politics?
Well, so the simple answer is nobody matters other than Putin. It doesn't matter what other people think, because if they express any diversion from his policy, they'll be arrested, imprisoned, and possibly killed. And so they're all just sitting there, just trying to keep their head down and hoping the boss doesn't come after them. It doesn't matter what oligarchs think, what senior government officials think. It doesn't matter what anyone thinks. Putin is running a total dictatorship. He's the dictator. He decides what's right. He decides what's wrong. He decides what pain he will inflict on his own people to achieve his personal goals. And his personal goal is to stay in power. And he thinks this war will help him stay in power. And he doesn't care how much money has been lost and how many lives have been lost. And if he lived in a normal democracy, he could have never done any of this type of stuff. I mean, Russia has lost 820,000 soldiers. In a normal democracy, if you lose 10,000 soldiers, the whole system comes undone. That's like a week and a half of war for Putin. He just doesn't care. And so we're dealing with a situation where he's got his own sort of strategy, his poker playing strategy, his bluffing, raising strategy, and there's no factors that influence him.
And by the same token, does the rate of inflation in Russia really matter to Putin? I mean, that's often one of the economic indicators that sometimes is used to suggest that public support is dipping, but we know that public opinion in Russia doesn't really count for very much at all. So, the fact that you've got CPI rate of inflation now going up to almost 10% again in Russia, does that mean anything?
Well, it does in one respect. It doesn't mean anything until the moment that it does. So it's like... he can inflict absolute total pain on everybody, all of his subjects, and get away with it until one moment when all of a sudden everybody says, we're not taking this anymore. And nobody knows what that moment is, and maybe that moment never comes. But the moment that you have a situation where people broadly are more angry than they're scared, that's the moment that he's afraid of, um, and that's the thing that's when inflation and 820,000 dead people and all the other terrible stuff that's going on that's when it comes to bear. But until then, he can do anything he wants.
I wanted to ask you, Bill, about what leverage Vladimir Putin may have on Donald Trump personally, because we saw in the wake of the election victory for Trump in November, they had a phone call a few days later. By all accounts, that didn't go the way the Kremlin wanted. And then the following day, naked footage of Melania Trump was broadcast on Russian TV. And I was speaking on Frontline yesterday to former military intelligence officer in Britain, former NATO planner Philip Ingram, and he was saying that was a shot across the bows, and that probably indicates that Putin and the Kremlin have more on Trump. Do you think they do, and do you think that potentially could be used to intimidate Trump and get him to back off or cede to Putin's demands?
I actually don't think so. I mean, look, Trump tried to overthrow the free and fair election in which he lost in 2020, and that didn't that didn't cause him any trouble. He's been caught with porn stars. He's been caught cheating on his taxes and his businesses and his charities, and none of that stuff seems to matter at all. And so I think I would argue that Trump is unblackmailable, and he can do anything he wants. And if somebody were to bring it to the world's attention, he would say, "Fake news. These are just my haters. That all manufactured, etc." I don't think that there's that issue at all. And furthermore, I don't think that there's any historic financial entanglements that might have led to Trump being more positive towards Putin, because Trump he's a like he doesn't discriminate against who he defaults on. He defaults on everybody. He's a multiple bankrupt person, who is not creditworthy, and so it's not like he respects one group of borrowers, or I should say lenders, more than the other. He just doesn't care. And so I would imagine that to the extent that he's partial towards Putin, it comes from something he's hoping to achieve in the future, whatever that is. And I don't know what that is, but it's not because of blackmail or previous financial entanglements.
And indeed, I suppose there is a risk for Vladimir Putin, even though blackmail is part of the Putin playbook, that if he tries to blackmail Trump, it may backfire and it may inflame Trump against him.
Of course it would. And I think that Trump would probably overreact. And so it's a pretty ballsy move if Putin were really to do that. And I don't think he would.
What do you think, Bill? I suppose this is the million or trillion dollar question of this year. What do you think a viable deal may look like that would be acceptable both to Volodymyr Zelensky here and now, but also to Vladimir Putin? Is there such a deal?
No, there's no such deal. And it's not because Zelensky wouldn't compromise. Zelensky is ready to do anything to stop the war up to a certain point. It's that Putin doesn't want to do a deal. And Putin has never wanted to do a deal. Putin has made it very clear from the very beginning that the only deal he wants is something that's effectively the total capitulation and collapse of Ukraine. And he's been very consistent about it. I mean, anyone who, there's been all these sort of ideas and sort of contours of a deal coming out of the Trump proxies and his staff, leaked to the press. But the way I view this is kind of like fantasy football. They can come up with anything they want, but the person that needs to want to do that deal would be Putin. And Putin doesn't want to do a deal. Putin wants this war to carry on, and so he can be victorious, because anything less than victorious, why would he have lost 820,000 soldiers and more than $1 trillion for some half-baked deal? He wants the whole thing. And so that's where you get into trouble here in terms of solving this either in 24 hours or 100 days, is that Putin doesn't really want to do that deal, as far as I can tell.
Do you think Donald Trump realises that? Or do you think, given he is a deal maker, Trump just assumes that's a negotiating tactic on Putin's behalf?
Well, I think that the one thing we might be able to surmise from his summary of of Putin's situation, I mean, he said it pretty much that he knows that Zelensky wants to make a deal. He doesn't know whether Putin wants to make a deal, and I think so that's probably the best summary we have yet. And of course, more information will come out, and maybe we'll hear something different. All we can do is speculate on some very unclear mumblings about the situation, and we're just going to have to see. I hope for Ukraine, for Europe, for decency that Trump continues to support Ukraine the way that America has, the way that Britain has, the way the EU has going forward, and he doesn't abandon Ukraine. Because if he does abandon Ukraine, I'll tell you what's going to happen is that we'll end up with 15 or 20 million Ukrainian refugees fleeing across Europe, and we'll end up with a few million in the UK. We'll have to boost our defense spending from 2% of GDP to 7% of GDP to defend ourselves against Russia. It'll be an absolute catastrophe. And so we have a lot of skin in the game to make sure that Ukraine doesn't collapse and that Trump doesn't abandon Ukraine.
And do you think that we do need to hear more from Ukraine's allies in Europe? Because, on one level, you could argue perfectly legitimately that Trump is right to say that for too long, Europe has maybe freeloaded off American largesse when it comes to defence spending. And certain NATO members have not even met the 2% of GDP defence commitment. Now, whether they will increase it to 5%, as Trump said recently he wanted to see, that seems unrealistic to me in the first instance at least. But there is a point there. And maybe Trump sees the war in Ukraine more broadly as part of Europe's historic failure to properly fund its own defence. And if that was changed, would Trump's view of the war in Ukraine change?
Well, I mean, as you say, Trump is not wrong. The numbers speak for themselves. A number of countries don't even spend close to the 2% that they're supposed to be spending. Germany as one main example. The problem for Trump is that, let's say that Germany and the UK and France and Spain and Italy all get up to 3 or 4% of GDP and really sort of militarize, then Trump has lost his leverage completely. All of a sudden, America is sort of sitting far away, and Europe is a military superpower in its own right. And I'm not sure how that serves long-term U.S. interests. I think U.S. is in a pretty good position to be sitting at the top of the top table right now in terms of determining how the world should be run. And if Trump forces that issue, it's going to be very expensive for Europe. Eventually, Europe will have to do that because we can't just leave ourselves exposed. And all of a sudden, the power dynamics change. The European Union plus the UK, we're talking about a population twice as big as the US. We're talking about a GDP which is enormous. All of a sudden, if Europe decides to act in unison and decides to act robustly, all of a sudden the U.S. becomes not the superpower.
Just finally, Bill, do you think there's a chance that Vladimir Putin may have underestimated Donald Trump?
Well, Vladimir Putin, I think, has underestimated everybody. He underestimated the Ukrainians. He thought the war was going to be won in a few days, and is 3 years in. He underestimated the Germans. He thought that they would never militarize and support Ukraine with equipment because they were so dependent on Russian gas. That didn't happen. I think he's underestimated everybody everywhere. He thought that he could just go around and intimidate and scare and pressure people into all sorts of bad decisions, and none of those things came to bear. He's lost his entire gas markets of Europe. He's lost pretty much all of his military infrastructure. He's lost $300 billion of reserves that are now frozen in the West. He's completely overplayed and misplayed his hand, and of course, we don't know what's going to happen with Trump. It's too early to say whether he's underestimated or overestimated Trump. Trump's behavior over the next few days, weeks, and months will determine whether he's going to be Putin's savior or he's going to be Putin's worst nightmare.
Bill Browder, we always appreciate your time here on Frontline. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.